They laughed, so did I first. That ugly run of sheet metal looked like a stovepipe that had lost a fight with a truck. I was Lieutenant Daniel Harkness, regular Army inventory soul, the kind of officer who believed in manuals the way a parishioner believes in hymns. And on a winter beachhead that measured time in high-angle flights and low expectations, a staff sergeant dragged his invention toward my machine gun and asked me to trust the one thing war tries to burn out of men: patience. The beachhead at Anzio is a geography of second guesses. Sea behind hills ahead, mud under everything that pretends to be a road. A Browning M1917A1 will give you honest work if you feed it straight and keep its water from running off in anger. Mud makes both hard. Cloth belts turn into soaked rope and kink like stubborn minds. The day before, Amos Walker, red to every tongue that saw his hair and wanted to be lazy, brought me his contraption. I had cleared 3 stoppages in a single hour and watched the loader come away from the cover with a handful of bleeding knuckles and an apology he didn't owe anyone. Walker's chute announced itself without charm, a long, tapering tunnel of scrap rivets. Set like a line of square-shouldered farmers, a small window cut into the near end so a loader could watch the round noses queue for the feedway. He had lined the inside with oiled canvas, torn, he confessed, from a drowned map case, and there was a flex joint patched from a fuel line that had already died once in North Africa. He spoke the way men speak when they are tired of being right in private. "Sir, gravity's free. We should use it." He tapped the lip where belt would enter. If the angle is true, the gun eats without drama. In a war built out of hardware, skepticism is a self-defense reflex. It looks like hell, I told him, because an officer is expected to keep decorum even around miracles he didn't request. He shrugged, which is something the rural Midwest must teach in school. "So does the sea, sir," he said, and wiped a smear of grease with a rag that could have told a longer story than I wanted to hear. What I remember most from that first afternoon is the smallness of the sounds. Not the gun, though, even at idle. The Browning hums, like it's remembering an argument from 1918, but the careful music around it, the snap of a rivet, checking in with the hammers past, the hiss of a hose, giving steam away home to Water Doyle's stopwatch, ticking like a metronome for nerves. Ortiz's breath flattening to match the cadence he hoped the gun would choose. We set the chest so the belt rose to the feedway without that treacherous dogleg that tired wrists invent. Ortiz held the belt lightly through the window. Walker locked the cover with the gentle insistence of a man closing his barn in a wind that always wins. At first, I stood there to supervise failure. Improvisation offends rank because it ignores appointment calendars. But the gun did not stutter. It didn't even clear its throat. It spoke in neat sentences. And the belt. Lord, the belt behaved. It lifted clean, never dipped into the soup, never kinked itself into an excuse. The hose whispered into the condenser, Kenwe'd half buried against shrapnel, and steam turned back into water like a humble sinner finding his pew. We ran bursts like gentlemen, then longer, because no one believes grace without a test. 30 minutes became an hour. A sane man would have cut it short to save ammunition for men who hadn't yet had their turn at bad luck. We became slightly less sane. 90 minutes. The barrel shone the blue of a tool being honest. The belt changed. Nobody bled. The gun kept its promises. I didn't give Walker the credit then. Officers hoard humility until it's safe to spend. But I felt my doctrine bend, not break bend. You could hear it in the way I stopped saying that thing and started saying the chute like it belonged to the gun's original grammar. We put the assembly aside as dusk ironed the sky. I told the crew we'd fit it again if the night got loud. It will, Walker said. Not fatalistic, just rural. He chalked numbers 1, 2, 3 on the ammo chest lids, so a tired man could count when counting mattered more than pride. Doyle retaped the steam line with 2 extra wraps, a superstition that had earned tenure. Ortiz oiled the inside of the chute with a modest hand, the way you'd butter a pan before you commit eggs to their chance at breakfast. Somewhere down the line, our mortars fell quiet under rain, thick enough to be a vote. Across the fields, the Germans rehearsed the old arithmetic push with assault guns, follow with men who believe orders outrank weather. The beachhead pays in coins you can't spend later sleep. Hope the last letter you meant to write before the post changed its mind. We do our best work anyway. That is the only merit the ground recognizes. I will tell you the truth. I went into that night planning to enjoy being right. Homemade usually means almost, and almost is a luxury we can indulge only before the whistle. But at the first flare, green, ugly fair, our world stepped forward into a narrower hallway, and the gun took its breath. The chute carried the belt like it had sworn to the flag of geometry. The Browning spoke in the voice a young officer hears once or twice in a career and never mistakes again a machine that has found its appetite and intends to mind its table manners while it eats. I still believed in books. I was about to believe in hands. The enemy announced himself with courtesy. A little MG burst through a gap that our wire pretended to own, then a deeper voice behind it that told us they'd brought something heavier to the discussion. The ground we'd spent all day cursing suddenly felt like the only thing in Italy that liked us. We sank into it, arranged our fear where it wouldn't ask for attention, checked our corners, counted our tracers. Orthodox tonight, I said, because in panic men drift toward theater, and I needed us to be clerks, precise, dull, right? The first belt entered the mouth like a fact. Ortiz set 2 fingers in the window as if he were reading Braille on a holy page and wanted a second opinion. Doyle rode the hose eyes on the Union, breathing shallow so his chest wouldn't move the steam into philosophy. Walker settled his shoulders under the T&E and made the modest adjustments a man makes when he's correcting the world politely. I watched the sight picture clear through the iron like a door line up in a frame and understood a little late that I had been borrowing the wrong metaphors. This wasn't a contraption. It was an angle. Our first burst stitched Earth just low enough to send the right kind of message. The second spoke to a stone wall that had begun to believe in helmets. The gun's voice stayed level. The belt did not even consider treachery. The chute, blunt down home unbeautiful, kept the only promise that mattered. The angle would not change just because our hearts did. Assaults flex. They pretend to rest, then explain themselves with anger. Ours came back with a rifle grenade that threw quick light on faces we didn't need to memorize. The Browning answered without hurry. Every 5th round nodded tracers into a geometry lesson, here, not there. Lower, not heroic. Steady, not interesting. I could feel the crew's fear choose where to sit. Not in their hands. That in battle is almost a miracle. And then the night tried to collect on the debt all good ideas owe. A bullet took a bite out of the steam hose where it kissed the condenser can. The Browning exhaled a wet sigh. For a count of 1, the world offered us a referendum on improvisation. Walker never looked up. Doyle was already inside the space where shrapnel takes notes, spinning the spare hose into the Union as if he'd rehearsed it in a barn when no one was watching. Tape. 2 extra wraps. Down into the water again. The gun inhaled like a man who has decided he'll forgive your interruption if you'll shut up now. We ran an hour on ordered bursts that taught the muzzle to be modest. The chute kept Sin at a distance. The little window was a chapel light on a storm night. Ortiz watched cartridge noses like a father watches a child's first steps, ready to help without stealing the moment. No one's fingers disappeared into dangerous places. No one said the worst word in a gun crew's dictionary jam. A runner tumbled in with a message that had the wrong accent. My name in his mouth, a report about the left fence. A quick note that the mortars were blind until the smoke remembered how to behave. I stood up into a sharper angle than wisdom recommends and caught a splinter of stone where a hero would have preferred a bullet. It felt like an insult from geology. You studied doctrine for years, and masonry puts you on your knee. Sir Walker's voice, no drama. We've got the fence, which is how you tell a superior officer, while the earth argues with the sky that you plan to deposit him gently out of the way. I crawled to the lip-tasted dirt that had not been food for 1,000 years and made the best tactical decision of my career. I stayed behind the men who were doing the job. Somewhere past the second hour, a paratrooper on the other side tried the last honest trick war as he ran with a bag of explosives and the idea that proximity erases aim. The tracers slid an inch low, then rose into him like conviction. The satchel did its ugly bloom at the only safe moment after the fact. I write this now, older than the gun that fed me with the knowledge that the difference between that man's victory and his end was 10 square feet of scrap, a few rivets, and the pride of a farm boy who believed mud should not be in charge. At 3 hours, the Browning's tone changed by a shade, the way a singer drops from chest to something wiser. I felt the crew make the micro-decisions that keep machines from turning on you, a polite splash of oil in the least dangerous place. A quick eye on the water site, fogging and clearing. A loose wrist on the traverse so you chase fear instead of letting fear chase you. I found my breath, obeying the burrs, which must be what religion feels like if you grow up in a choir. Toward 4, the sky committed its first faint lie about morning. The attack learned what all attacks do, that endurance is a weapon, in armies too stubborn to measure themselves in minutes. The whistle on their side sounded like a complaint more than an order. Our last burst cut a final seam along a hedgerow that had run out of opinions. The gun shut its mouth with the courtesy of a man at a long table saying, "Gentlemen at the end of a meal," and then the smallness again. Ortiz laying his palm on the jacket and swearing with gratitude, not anger. Doyle's forehead on the ammo chest, breathing like he'd outrun someone bigger, and decided not to be smug about it. Walker staring through the iron at an absence he had personally negotiated. I did not say I was wrong. I did the thing a proper officer does after the best men in the world save his plan from himself. I cleared the gun, checked the hose, and asked mildly what we needed for the next time the night wanted to have this argument. Walker said 3 more screws like he was ordering nails at a feed store. I nodded as if I had contributed something. They laughed again in the morning, but softer, like men who have learned which jokes are safe and which ones the night has confiscated. I signed the line for ammunition and wrote a report that read like penance. It named parts by their wrong names because there were no correct ones for what Walker had built. I stapled it to a requisition to evaluate field-fabricated belt guides for M1917A1, which is how an officer says he intends to keep something the war gave him for free. Ordnance would file it under weather. The Beachhead filed it under survival. We fitted the chute on a sister gun down the trench, and I made a private compromise with pride. When men asked, I said, "We built it," and then when their eyes insisted, I corrected to Walker. The day unfolded as if war had decided to try being administrative. We stacked the empty chests, policed The lynx bled the jacket with a gentleness you give to livestock that has earned the right to be called by name. Somewhere beyond our wire, a German runner folded beside a shovel he had stolen from a farmhouse a year before the war. I wrote letters that did not mention the hose because the censor would erase ingenuity as eagerly as fear. Ortiz carved the number 4 into the wood rim of the condenser can because men keep score when they cannot keep sleep. Doyle stretched his bad shoulder against the world and grinned with a mouth that borrowed its courage from the last 12 hours. The fight moved but did not end. Anzio morphed the way mud dries out of spite. The line that had been a cage pretended to be a door. We were careful not to believe it. When it finally broke in May and turned into a road pointed at Rome, we rode in half-tracks that wore new paint like bravado and mounted Brownings that came with factory chutes, tidy and indifferent. I tried one because Doctrine is a jealous god. It kinked a belt after the first mile of ruts and looked at me as if the fault were mine. Walker said nothing. He unbolted the store-bought solution, buckled on his stovepipe, and the gun remembered how to mind its manners. In the city that had been promised in postcards, I walked past arches that had been told they were immortal and felt no triumph, only the careful gratitude of a man whose luck had minded the lanes. In August, we went to southern France in a breeze of rumor and salt. The fields there wore a green that believed in itself. We set the gun in a ditch that had learned through 1,000 rains how to be a friend. A Frenchman in a hat that deserved a song handed me a bottle with a label that tried to apologize for everything and failed. The chute patched now with a rivet taken from a jerry can cradle, and a strip of canvas that remembered a drowned map of Sicily kept the belt high, and the belt behaved like it had read the script. When the Germans ran, they ran with a discipline that made me respect them and hate the necessity in the same breath. We held because we had learned to be boring where boredom kept men alive. In the Vosges, the rain came to collect a debt I did not remember incurring. The forest taught us how many ways a year can end inside a single week. We slung the Browning under branches that dripped opinions, and the chute, oiled dark and scratched, saved us in quiet increments. Nobody would decorate. Belts lifted instead of wallowing. Fingers stayed at their jobs instead of becoming casualties. The steam line became a ritual we could do blind. If you ever lose your faith in method, fight a wet war with a machine that only stays honest when you are. It should be said that I tried to do the official thing. I took the chute to a captain from Ordnance, who kept his uniform pressed by force of personality. I laid the metal on a trestle table and used the voice you use with men who stamp papers for a living. I said, "Angle gravity grain window." He looked at the rivets like they were a breach of etiquette and said procurement cycles did not recognize this sort of initiative. I nodded with the courtesy you extend to a sign that says the bridge is out when you can see the bridge is right there. Then I walked the chute back to the gun that trusted it. Some nights I imagined how this would sound after the war on a porch, with a June wind and a glass that thought it could cure old injuries. There is a version of this story where I am the enlightened officer who championed new thinking and saved lives with memos. That is the wrong version? The right one is smaller. I stopped being in the way. I learned to measure men by the problems they do not leave for someone else. I made a habit of asking the machine the same question I asked the map. What do you need that I can give you quickly? We met prisoners on roads that had lost their patience. A boy with hay in his hair and mud in his soul looked at our gun with a grief I understood. Later, near a crossroads where a church had negotiated with history and won, I handed a parched German a tin of water, and he said, "Thank you," in English that had been taught by a careful woman somewhere on the other side. He asked what we called the thing that kept our belt from drowning. I told him the truth. We called it walkers. At night in the Vosges, the men sometimes traded quiet for laughter around a stove that had no right to be warm. A Texan from another company taught Ortiz a tune that sounded like a horizon seen on horseback. Someone produced a hat that had been illegal 3 commands ago. The wind pushed at the canvas the way a restless animal leans into a gate to see if it is still locked. The Browning slept on its tripod, its hose coiled like a tired snake, the chute propped against a ration crate, as if it had a right to lean. I looked down the inside of it along the polished track where 1,000 round noses had learned to behave, and felt something you should not indulge in a war pride. When I finally wrote home with something close to honesty, I told my sister that I had discovered the virtue of a single sentence that would not survive the censor under pressure. Philosophy is an angle. I did not write that I had learned to love men for the stubbornness in their hands. I did not write that the only way to keep mud from winning is to refuse to let it decide how your tools eat. I kept those for later, for a room where no one is listening and the gun has been asleep for years. Peace, when it came, did not announce itself with trumpets. It crept in through the inbox, through the way boots sounded on a floor that no longer expected to be muddy, through the silence after a range day when no one flinched at the echo. I brought the army out of my pockets, one inventory at a time. I signed for less. I slept more. I shipped the Browning back to a depot that would teach it to live without us. The chute I signed to myself by accident, which is to say, I failed to notice it in the bottom of a crate until the paperwork was far away. I told myself I would send it on. I did not. Back home, the town had a way of greeting you with proof that it had been generous in your absence. Children were taller. A feed store had learned the name of the woman who kept it alive. Men shook your hand like they were negotiating with a magician. I put the chute on a shelf in a narrow garage and promised not to turn it into a relic. The promise lasted until the first time I reached for it to show someone who had not been there. It had weight that did not belong to metal. I married late because the war had leased too many years in my name. My wife taught school and insisted that the past be an instructor, not a roommate. On Saturdays, we drove to the county fair where there was a man under a hand-lettered sign who could mend the broken handle of a tool without making a speech about it. The first time I recognized the jawline and the grin that tried to disbelieve itself, I almost laughed out loud in the way you do when the story bends to meet you. Walker's hair had made a peace treaty with the world, but his hands still carried the memory of heat. On the table was a corner of aluminum bent into a curve that could have been part of a dream. Beside it, scuffed and certain, the chute. He nodded at me the way men nod when they have shared a night, and never mentioned it to anyone who wouldn't understand. We didn't talk about the battle. We talked about angle and grain and how water becomes steam and then keeps its promise to come home if you show it the way. He told me he had cut the window with a hacksaw that had already been tired when it left Kansas. I told him I'd tried to give it to Ordnance, and that Ordnance had been too busy protecting the dignity of procurement to notice their life had been extended by stubborn mercy. He laughed with no bitterness. We ate pie with plastic forks. A boy asked if the gun had really run 4 hours. Walker said long enough. I said long enough to change an officer's mind. Years later, a letter arrived from a museum that liked its truths compact. A German veteran had sent a recollection about an American gun that refused to be humiliated by mud. His name was Becker. He wrote about the patience of steam and the discourtesy of tracers that corrected themselves. He said the chute changed his plan. I stood at the kitchen counter, the letter trembling a little, because my hands remembered a night more vividly than my eyes did, and I realized that what we had built in a bad square of Italy had crossed a wire none of us had strung enemy respect. I mailed my own recollection to the curator and left out the part where I had laughed first. When I taught young officers later brief stints, guest lectures that smelled of chalk and ambition, I brought the chute in unannounced. I set it on the desk and let them name it wrong for a minute. Then I told them the doctrine I trusted more than any line of text: under stress machines, behave like the people who feed them. If you starve a gun with angles, it will repay you with chaos. If you overbuild the boring parts, it will be astonishing when astonishment is all you have left. I said that leadership is often the art of getting out of the way of someone's better idea. I said that mud is a liar if you refuse to let it speak for your tools. In the end, the chute did go to a museum because my wife claimed the garage for things that made our lives simpler. A glass case swallowed it. Children pressed their noses to the window in the metal the way our loader had pressed his fingers to the window in the metal, and I allowed myself that small private symmetry. On a card, someone wrote a sentence that made the story polite. The truth was less ceremonial. The truth was a man from Kansas refused to be managed by mud, and another man who loved manuals learned to love hands. Sometimes when the house is too quiet and the clock stakes its claim on another hour, I visit the shelf where the rivet the conservator returned sits in a dish. I balance it on my palm and remember the way the Browning's voice dropped a half note at 3 hours and the way the sky over the sea began to admit it would change its mind. I remember Ortiz humming a song that borrowed its courage from places he had not seen since he was a kid. I remember Doyle looping tape twice more than he needed, because superstition is just experience insisting on respect. I remember saying orthodox and discovering that orthodoxy can be handmade. They laughed, we all did, because laughter is a hedge against hope. Then the gun ran 4 hours straight, and we learned to guard a different thing. Not the gun, not the chute, not even the night. We learned to guard the refusal to accept failure as normal. If war taught me anything worth passing on, it is that men survive by overbuilding the small joints of the world, and by trusting the ones who know which angle keeps a promise. If this story moved, you hit like, subscribe, and share so more people can find these hidden, Baba-oo-tao human stories. What small, boring fix saved your day when everything else was going wrong? Tell us below.